I'm Rebecca Lawson, 33 years old, and at a family gathering one summer evening, my sister-in-law handed me a stack of place cards, like I was hired help. I set them down neatly, pretending not to notice the smirk on her face. My dress was plain bought from a local boutique, and in their eyes, that was enough to mark me as different. What no one at the long polished table realized was that every vine outside the window, every acre of soil beneath their shoes, was about to belong to me. In that moment, I chose silence, because soon they would all see the truth. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe if you've ever had to prove yourself in a room where no one believed you belonged. I grew up far from estates and chandeliers, raised by my mother in a rented duplex on the edge of a small Oregon town. She worked 2 jobs, one cleaning motel rooms, the other tending plants at local greenhouses. When she came home, her hands were stained with soil, yet she still pressed my uniforms and made sure I had what I needed for school. We didn't have heirlooms or inheritances, but we had determination, and she taught me that hard work could become its own kind of wealth. College was my first doorway into another world. I won a scholarship to study engineering and sustainable systems at the University of Washington, commuting by bus at dawn to make my shifts in the research lab. There, I met Daniel. He was brilliant, quiet, endlessly thoughtful, the kind of man who carried books with notes scribbled in every margin. His family name carried weight in California wine country, a world of summer estates and charity galas. When he asked me to marry him, I believed love would be enough to bridge the distance between his world and mine. But on the day of our wedding, I felt the first chill. Margaret, my new mother-in-law, smiled for photographs without ever meeting my eyes. Caroline asked if my mother was bringing food to the reception, as if she were the caterer. Daniel never noticed or chose not to. I brushed it off, then telling myself it didn't matter that kindness would be enough to earn my place. The early years of marriage blurred between my career at a clean energy startup and visits to the Lawson estate. At the table, they would ask polite questions, then talk over my answers. When wine spilled, a napkin was pushed toward me. When chairs ran short, I was the one to step aside. I smiled through it, convinced that silence was strength, but each small slight chipped away at me. By the time another harvest celebration arrived, the whispers had grown sharper. I overheard Margaret tell a guest that I was fine, just not polished, and I carried those words with me all night. I returned to our guest room, opened my laptop, and began running the numbers on my investments. That evening, a quiet idea began to take root. They saw me as invisible, but they had no idea just how wrong they were. The first time Margaret let me know I didn't belong was subtle enough that no one else seemed to notice. We had just walked into the courtyard of the estate late from a flight. Guests were gathered around her, their glasses lifted in greeting, when she leaned close to the woman at her side and said, clear enough for me to hear, Rebecca's fine, just not polished. Doesn't really fit this circle, you know. She smiled to the crowd as though nothing had passed her lips, but the words landed hard. I nodded politely as if nothing had reached me, but the sting followed me through the evening. After that, the small humiliations kept coming. Caroline once looked across a table crowded with relatives and guests and called me remarkably grounded, then laughed and added that it must come from my farm roots. A few people chuckled and the conversation shifted away. No one noticed me stiffen in my chair or glance down at the napkin in my lap. I baked a lemon tart one year, left it in the kitchen with a note, only to hear Margaret praise the caterers for their best work yet. Each time I stayed quiet, careful, almost convincing myself that silence was easier than defending my place. The seating arrangements told the same story. During one spring gathering, I spent the afternoon helping set the long table outside under the lights. I laid out rosemary sprigs, folded napkins, and checked every card twice. When dinner began, there were 14 chairs for 15 people. Without hesitation, I said I'd eat inside. The others nodded grateful and continued with their wine. Later that evening, Daniel told me he hadn't noticed, and somehow that made it worse. There were countless smaller moments. A coat handed to me at the door that didn't belong to me. A spilled glass pushed toward my hands with the expectation I'd clean it. Questions about my work followed by conversations that carried on without pause. Margaret would turn to the other daughters-in-law and ask about their children's schools, their home remodels, their exercise routines. When her attention shifted to me, it was always the same line. "So are you still working on that little project?" My company was advising counties on clean energy, cutting emissions, building systems for the future. But in her voice, it became something trivial, a hobby too small to take seriously. Daniel would sometimes squeeze my hand under the table, a quiet apology. But he never corrected her, never raised his voice on my behalf. I tried to brush it off. I told myself it was just generational, just different worlds. But the pattern built slowly, like water carving grooves in stone. Each dismissal smoothed me down until I barely recognized the version of myself I became inside those walls. I stopped correcting them when they used the wrong title for my work. I stopped sharing updates unless someone asked, and no one ever did. I put away my heels, let my makeup bag gather dust, convincing myself that comfort was the reason when the truth was simpler. I was trying not to be noticed at all. Over time, I began to fold myself smaller and smaller. I was still the one who arrived early to help set up, but never the one included in the group photos that later lined the hall. I brought gifts from my travels, scarves, woven by hand olive oil, pressed by families I had worked with, small pieces of art from local makers. They were accepted politely, then forgotten. I saw my reflection in those moments, not in the polished silverware, but in the way I stepped back from conversations, the way my shoulders curved forward in pictures as if I could vanish into the background. One lunch stands out clearly even now. We sat in the garden plates of salad set in front of us when Robert Daniel's uncle chuckled about my background. "You should start a compost blog or something," he said, and the table erupted in easy laughter. I smiled, but later I sat alone in that same garden, my plate empty, the voices drifting through the windows behind me, and I realized something heavy. It wasn't only that they dismissed me, it was that I had started dismissing myself. Without meaning to, I had let them draw the outline of who I was supposed to be, and I had colored inside the lines. That afternoon, as the sunlight stretched across the vines, I promised myself it would be the last time I walked away feeling powerless. It was a quiet shift, the kind no one else would notice, but it took hold all the same. I was tired of bending myself into their shape, tired of waiting for recognition that never came. The change didn't roar in, it settled like a seed under the surface, ready to grow. And by the time we boarded our flight home that evening, I had already started to think differently. I pulled out my journal and wrote one line across the top of a blank page. "Don't fight to sit at their table. Build your own and buy the land beneath theirs." The words stared back at me in the dim light of the cabin, steady and sharp. I didn't know then just how far they would carry me, but I knew enough to close the book and hold it close, a reminder that I would not return to the estate in the same way again. The months that followed that quiet promise on the plane were harder than I expected. Outwardly, nothing seemed different. I still walked into the estate with the same cautious smile, still helped with the little things no one else wanted to do. Yet inside, something was shifting. Each gathering felt heavier, like I was carrying not just my own silence, but the weight of all the years I had bent myself smaller to fit their image. At Thanksgiving, Margaret turned to me halfway through dinner. She had just asked Caroline about her children's new school program, listened intently, and smiled with approval. Then she glanced at me and asked in that same pleasant tone, "So, Rebecca, are you still working on your little business?" Her fork hovered over her plate, as if the answer hardly mattered. Daniel gave my hand a gentle squeeze under the table, his silent way of telling me to let it pass. I smiled politely, but the word little echoed long after the conversation had moved on. The estate itself began to feel like a stage where I played the same role each year. I showed up early to set tables or arrange flowers, and when the photographs were framed afterward, my face was missing. Margaret and Caroline stood center, smiling, glasses raised, while I was somewhere at the edge or not there at all. In time, I stopped volunteering to step into the pictures. It seemed easier to let them forget I was there. Daniel noticed the strain in small ways, though he rarely spoke about it. One evening after a dinner party, as we walked back to the guest house, he said softly, "They don't mean anything by it." His voice was tired, his eyes on the gravel path. I wanted to ask why he never corrected them, why he let their words fill the silence, but the words caught in my throat. We walked on without speaking, the only sound the crunch of our steps in the dark. By spring, the changes in me were visible, even if no one acknowledged them. My clothes grew plainer. I stopped wearing jewelry I once loved, telling myself it was for comfort, though deep down I knew I was trying not to draw attention. At one luncheon, Robert leaned across the table with a smirk. "You always seem so practical, Rebecca. You could start a compost column in the paper." Laughter rippled around the table. I smiled faintly and lowered my gaze, but later that night I sat awake staring at the ceiling of the guest room, feeling smaller than ever. It wasn't only the way they spoke to me, but the way I began to mirror it. I stopped sharing new projects unless directly asked. And even then, my answers grew shorter. When people got my title wrong, I didn't bother to correct them. Each unspoken correction became another small surrender, and I felt myself disappearing piece by piece. At one gathering in the vineyard courtyard, I folded napkins and placed sprigs of rosemary just as I had countless times before. When dinner began, Margaret realized there was one seat too few. She looked around, then at me, and before she said anything, I offered I can eat inside. She nodded, relieved, and turned back to the table. No one protested. Later that night, Daniel whispered that he truly hadn't noticed. I believed him, and that was almost worse than if he had. The estate staff treated me kindly, always with a respectful smile, but even they seemed to understand the role I played. Once, when I carried a tray of glasses to the kitchen after a spill, one of the servers gently tried to take it from me, saying, "You don't have to do that." I let him take it, but the truth was I had been doing it for so long it felt natural. The pattern carved deeper each year. I became the person who handled coats, fetched extra plates, and stepped away from the table without being asked. My presence was convenient but not essential, and I convinced myself that was enough. I told myself my real life existed outside those gates with the work I did and the people who respected me. But inside, I was only a shadow. The breaking point came quietly. After one lunch, where Margaret compared Caroline's accomplishments to an article she had read and then turned to me with that same empty smile, I excused myself and walked into the garden alone. The air was still heavy with the scent of lavender, and the laughter from inside drifted out through the open windows. I sat on a stone bench, staring at the vines stretching across the hills, and realized something painful. I had let them decide the borders of where I belonged. And worse, I had complied with it. That realization settled into me like a stone. I knew I couldn't keep living inside the outline they had drawn. It was no longer about what Margaret or Caroline thought of me, or whether Daniel noticed. It was about the way I had begun to see myself. That afternoon, I promised quietly that the next time I left those gates, it would not be with the same weight I had carried for so long. I stayed silent through the rest of the visit, speaking when spoken to, smiling when expected. But inside, the soil was shifting. I didn't know yet how the change would come, only that it had to. That spring flight home from the estate felt different from all the ones before. I opened my journal, resting it against the fold-down tray, and wrote one single line across the top of the page. Don't fight to sit at their table. Build your own and buy the land beneath theirs. I stared at the words until the cabin lights dimmed. They didn't feel like a passing thought, but the start of something I couldn't yet name. The idea grew slowly, not in loud declarations, but in quiet moments no one else noticed. During business trips, I stayed up late running numbers on my laptop. Years of saving stock options and early investments had built into something solid. For the first time, I saw not just stability, but possibility. Each calculation turned into a small thread, and soon a new picture began to take shape. I remembered my mother kneeling in the dirt floor of our greenhouse behind the duplex, patching plastic roofing with tape, her hands raw but steady. She had always told me that soil held patience, that good things took root quietly before anyone could see them. That memory stayed with me as I started looking at properties. I wasn't searching for grandeur. I was searching for ground that could be rebuilt. The first vineyard I found wasn't glamorous. 12 acres in northern Oregon, undervalued with irrigation problems and panels in need of replacement. I called an old colleague named Alex who had left our energy firm to start consulting for sustainable agriculture. He listened without surprise when I asked questions about the land, about the numbers. By the end of that week, I had signed the papers. That single step gave me momentum. Each project became a rhythm, an early flight, a meeting with growers, long walks across rows of vines that needed care. I learned from seasonal workers what broke and what needed fixing, and I listened to winemakers who had been ignored by larger estates. These weren't trophies to display. They were places where work mattered, where changes could be measured in both crops and community. Daniel never asked why I traveled so often, and I didn't volunteer the answers. He assumed I was consulting for county energy boards, and in part that wasn't wrong. But each time I came home with soil still clinging to my shoes, he was too busy grading papers to notice. Our conversations grew shorter, filled with polite updates instead of real connection. I wanted to share the excitement, but the silence between us had already thickened. Within 2 years, my company, Northwood Harvest Partners, held shares in multiple vineyards across California. By the 3rd year, we had gained majority ownership in 3. I built a small operations team, 1 logistics planner, 1 agricultural analyst, and a part-time attorney who spent weekends reviewing contracts. We worked steadily, carefully, never drawing attention. For once, I felt like I wasn't fading. I was building. Then came the thought that felt both impossible and inevitable: the Lawson estate itself. The land that Margaret praised in every toast, the rows of vines that Daniel grew up walking through the house, filled with portraits and polished silver. It had always been treated as untouchable, a birthright, passed down like a family crest. But birthrights couldn't cover debts, and whispers had already started to reach me. One summer, the family's charity gala wasn't held on the estate lawn, but in a rented hall in Santa Rosa. Margaret claimed it was for easier parking, but I recognized the truth. Later came the lawsuit over water diversion, the one Margaret once bragged about as a clever trick. The court saw it differently, and the fines were heavy. Behind their polished image, cracks were spreading. I tracked the listing when it appeared buried behind layers of private broker language. It was marketed quietly, meant for legacy transfers, the kind of sale whispered among old families. But I was already prepared. Through a separate entity, Pine Grove LLC, my team made the offer. The negotiations moved quickly, their desperation plain in the concessions they accepted. When the papers were signed, I added one clause myself. The family could retain access to host gatherings for 5 years, up to 4 seasonal events each year. I didn't keep it out of kindness. I wanted them to keep arriving unaware, carrying their wine and their assumptions onto ground that no longer belonged to them. Daniel found out from a group text Caroline sent to the family. "New ownership could be good," she wrote. "Maybe they'll finally fix the north wing." He laughed when he read it aloud to me, shaking his head at the idea of strangers running the estate. I smiled back, saying nothing. In that silence, I felt the full weight of what was coming. The following summer, I returned to the estate just as I always had. Same simple suitcase, same plain dress. Margaret hugged me with her arms, but not her heart just as before. The family carried on as they always did. Robert with his new companion Caroline with her polished hair and sharp glances, Daniel moving boxes of wine like the dutiful son. No one suspected anything had changed. That evening, I stepped aside to take a phone call from Ethan, the new estate manager I had personally chosen months earlier. His voice was steady, professional, but his words carried something more. "Welcome back, boss," he said. I stood under the archway, the sound of laughter drifting across the courtyard, and whispered back, "Let them enjoy the weekend. Then we begin." Inside the portraits, silver and linens all looked the same, but beneath the surface, every document, every deed, every code had shifted into my hands. The house carried on as if nothing had changed, and that was exactly how I wanted it. The moment I had waited for was near, and this time I wouldn't be the one shrinking at the edge of the table. The second night of the Lawson summer gathering fell into the same familiar rhythm. Dinner was set beneath the trellis just outside the main house, where the vineyard stretched wide into soft evening light. A long table had been arranged with folded linens, rosemary tucked into each place setting. Glasses glinted under strands of hanging bulbs, and the air smelled faintly of grilled lemon and thyme. Margaret handed me a stack of place cards without hesitation. "Rebecca, dear, would you mind setting these out?" "You always do them so neatly," she said, already turning toward someone else. I took them with a nod, just as I always had, laying them one by one down the long stretch of white cloth. Mine, as expected, was near the end, by the fan close to the server's entrance. No one noticed, and that was still the point. Dinner began without formality. Caroline laughed loudly at something Robert said, and someone across the table raised a toast to the harvest. A few guests commented on the wine, some unfamiliar with the new label on the bottle, others grumbling about a lack of complimentary cases. "No more comp crates?" Robert asked, surprised. "Probably being run by some spreadsheet-happy consultant now." Daniel leaned in, chuckling under his breath. "Can't blame them. Might finally be turning a profit." I reached for my glass of water and said nothing. The wine they were drinking had been bottled under a label I approved. Every bottle on the table, every row of vines outside every hallway in the house was mine. But I let the moment pass untouched. The staff moved quietly between tables dressed in new uniforms I had selected months earlier, organic cotton stitched with the Northwood Harvest insignia. Caroline didn't seem to notice, or perhaps assumed it was a new sponsor. Inside the house, nothing looked different. The portrait still hung in the same spots. The napkin ring still bore the family crest. But everything that mattered had changed. Ethan called me just before dessert. I stepped away from the table to answer. He was standing just outside the stone arch near the private garden, dressed in dark slacks and a clean button-down, a folded sheet of paper in hand. "Ready?" he asked. I looked toward the table one last time, Margaret whispering something to a guest, Robert pouring himself another glass, and said, "Do it." A few moments later, Ethan stepped through the arch and tapped his spoon gently against the rim of a wineglass. Once, then twice. The sound rang clear, and the table quieted slowly. Conversations dimmed. Forks stilled. "Good evening," Ethan began, his voice even. Before dessert is served, we have a brief announcement from the estate's management team. I watched from the shadows near the arch as heads turned. Margaret tilted her head slightly. Caroline pulled her shawl tighter. Daniel froze mid-sip. Ethan continued. As many of you may know, the estate underwent a change in ownership earlier this year. While we kept the transition private to ensure a smooth handover, we're now honored to introduce the principal owner, the woman behind every improvement you've seen this weekend. He turned toward me just as I stepped forward. My chair had been pushed back, the soft scrape of it nearly lost in the hush. He waited, then said clearly, "Please join me in recognizing Ms. Rebecca Lawson." There was no applause, just stunned silence. I walked forward, my heels clicking softly on the stone. Margaret's wine glass tilted deep red, soaking slowly into the ivory tablecloth. Caroline stared without blinking. Robert lowered his fork mid-bite. Daniel turned to me and didn't say a word. I stopped at the head of the table, the seat where Margaret usually sat, and didn't take it. I reached for the small microphone Ethan had left nearby and looked across their faces one by one. "Don't worry," I said calmly. "You're all still welcome here." The silence thickened around the table. Just like everyone else now, I let that hang in the air before I added, "There will be no more legacy discounts, no backdoor bookings, no comped family-only shipments. This is now a working vineyard and a public one." No one moved. Caroline's mouth opened slightly, then closed again. Margaret's lips twisted into something close to a smile, but it didn't hold. Daniel still hadn't said a word. I handed the microphone to the pianist, who struck a single low note before transitioning into something soft and distant. Then I turned and walked away. The gravel crunched under my shoes as I stepped back into the courtyard. The string lights flickered overhead. Laughter had faded into quiet. For the first time in 10 years, I had stood in front of that table without asking permission. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't made a scene. I hadn't needed to. That night, no one came to find me. Margaret stayed inside. Carolyn disappeared before the dessert trays made their rounds. Robert poured himself another glass and avoided eye contact. 2 nights later, I stood behind the curtain in the estate's event hall. The legacy family reception was already underway. Polished shoes, soft music, the scent of eucalyptus and champagne. In past years, Margaret had opened the evening with a short speech about tradition. This year, she hadn't been invited to speak. I stepped onto the platform as the servers cleared glasses and placed coasters printed with the new logo. The spotlight felt warm, steady. Conversations hushed one by one. "Good evening," I said. "Some of you already know me. Some of you only thought you did." I clicked the small remote in my hand, and the screen behind me shifted. A clean aerial rendering of the southern vineyard filled the screen, reimagined with cabins, walking trails, and a wellness center surrounded by lavender fields. "In the spring, we'll be expanding operations," I said. "New cabins, a retreat space focused on agricultural healing, and a community dock open to local families year-round. More shifting in seats." Caroline sat straighter. Robert leaned forward. Daniel stood in the back, silent. The next slide displayed a stone plaque etched with a name, the Eleanor Morgan Fund. "It's named after my mother," I said. "She cleaned motel rooms for 16 years. She raised me with nothing but a rented greenhouse and her bare hands." Margaret's face stayed still. Daniel looked away. I advanced to the final slide, private lease review summer season. Underneath a quiet list of parcel codes. "We'll be reviewing all private long-term lease agreements, especially those formed through outdated arrangements." I didn't need to name names. They already knew. As I stepped off the stage, the room stayed quiet. Only the pianist's soft playing filled the space. I walked past the tables slowly. No one stopped me. Robert looked at his phone. Caroline clutched her shawl. Margaret didn't speak. Then Marcus, Daniel's cousin, hurried to catch up. "Rebecca, can we talk?" I paused and said, Sure, you can schedule something through guest services, just like everyone else. Then I kept walking. The email started 3 days after the event hall reception. The first came from Caroline. The subject line read, "Small clarification," followed by 4 carefully crafted paragraphs about her lease. She mentioned how she had always assumed the guest house was covered by a family arrangement, and how she'd been told it was acceptable to sublet occasionally. I forwarded the message to our legal team without comment. By noon, she followed up with a 5-minute voice memo. In it, she used the word mistake 7 times, tradition 4 times, and whispered, please, twice. Her sublets over the last 3 years had netted her more than $40,000. None of it reported all of it in violation of her agreement. I didn't respond directly. Instead, I sent her a list of recommended accountants and a brief note, "You'll want someone thorough." 2 days later, she received a formal notice from the State Revenue Department requesting documentation for audit review. Robert's situation surfaced shortly after. He had been using 2 small parcels for private tastings, inviting select clients, charging under the table, and tapping into estate utilities without paying proper site fees. His name didn't appear on any official roster. I gave him 30 days to vacate. After the deadline, I transferred both lots to a nonprofit that runs weekend retreats for veterans and caregivers. A crew moved in by July. The voicemail I received that evening was full of disbelief. "Rebecca, honey, this must be some mix-up. We're family." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Because for Robert, family had always meant something useful until it didn't. Margaret didn't call. She came in person. She showed up in the main office without an appointment, wearing a blazer far too formal for the heat and pearls that caught the afternoon light. Her expression was composed, but her eyes were searching. "I just want to talk," she said, smoothing her skirt as she sat across from my desk. Woman to woman. I listened quietly as she spoke. She talked about unity, about what people might think if the family appeared divided, about optics legacy, and the importance of presenting a consistent message. Then she paused and folded her hands neatly. "This isn't really about me," she said. "It's about Daniel." I reached into the drawer and pulled out the envelope I'd prepared months earlier. I slid it across the desk. She glanced down at it, her smile thinning. Inside were 3 formal complaints submitted during her time as co-chair of the estate's cultural board, 2 from junior employees, 1 from an intern. Each documented inappropriate comments she had made. All were resolved quietly after my acquisition, with compensation apologies and clean references. She opened the envelope, scanned the contents, and looked up. "I didn't know these had been filed." "They hadn't," I said, "until I asked." She sat back, her shoulders stiff. "Are you threatening me?" "No," I said, keeping my voice level. "I'm informing you. If you choose to go public, so will this." She didn't reply. She placed the papers back in the envelope and stood slowly. Her nod was brief. She walked out without looking back. After she left, I didn't feel triumph, just clarity. There were no raised voices, no slammed doors, just a door that finally stayed closed behind her. Daniel didn't fight me, not once. In the days following the announcement, he pulled away in the quietest ways. He stayed out later, forgot appointments, spent more time on campus than usual. Then came the night we sat out on the back porch, a bottle of wine untouched between us. The vineyard rolled into shadows under a silver sky. Crickets hummed somewhere in the dark. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice barely above the breeze. I looked down at my hands. "Because you never asked." "I thought I didn't need to," he said, and there was a break in his voice I hadn't heard in years. "That's the problem." We sat like that for a long time. No arguments, no accusations, just space. Truth uncoiled in the silence between us. Years of pretending, of tiptoeing, of telling ourselves that avoidance was gentler than honesty. At the end of the night, I said something I hadn't even known until I spoke it aloud. I didn't stay because I was waiting for your family to accept me. I stayed because I hoped one day you'd see me. He didn't answer. Not then. A few weeks later, Daniel packed a few boxes and left quietly. No slammed doors, no bitter words, just a soft goodbye spoken from the front steps of a house we had outgrown in different ways. There was grief, but not regret. 3 mornings after he moved out, I woke just before sunrise. No alarm, no pressing calendar reminders. I made coffee in the quiet barefoot on the tile. The house was still, not empty, just quiet in a new way. I stepped out onto the dock with my mug in hand and watched mist hover over the lake. The sun hadn't risen yet, but the light had started to change. And for the first time in years, I wasn't holding my breath. The dock was still damp with morning mist when I returned inside. The kitchen lights stayed off. I moved through the house by memory, the silence unbroken. There were no messages from Daniel, no check-ins from Margaret or Caroline. It had been a week since the last of them left the estate grounds, and not a single one had returned a call or scheduled an appointment through guest services. I didn't expect them to. Later that morning, I walked the southern fields with Ethan to review plans for the new greenhouse. The east structure had collapsed during a winter storm the year before, and we'd delayed the rebuild until the land stabilized. I told him I wanted it named after my mother. He nodded once. It's already on the blueprints. We passed 2 workers from the maintenance crew clearing irrigation lines. One of them, Marcus, different. Marcus, not Daniel's cousin, tipped his cap and asked about the wellness center timeline. I gave him the honest answer late spring. The lavender fields needed another cycle to root, and the structural permits for the cabins were still moving slowly through zoning. He smiled, nodded, and got back to work. That afternoon, I sat at the large desk in the main office and drafted a letter to the estate's long-term employees, the ones who had stayed through 3 generations of Lawson management. Many of them had worked twice as hard as the family ever realized. They had gone unrecognized in newsletters, unpaid for overtime, and uninvited to the receptions. I kept the letter short. I thanked them. I told them the land wasn't just changing hands, it was changing values. If they had ideas, memories, or knowledge to share, my door was open. I signed it with my full name, Rebecca Lawson Owner, Northwood Harvest, not as a reminder, as a promise. The following week, I stood alone in the great hall. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows and landed on the long wooden table that had once seated every member of the Lawson family for Christmas dinners, harvest brunches, and wine auctions. I walked the length of it, trailing my fingers along the polished edge. They had always spoken about legacy like it was a possession embossed, inherited, sealed in tradition. But standing there, I felt none of that weight, just space. I pulled out one of the chairs, not Margaret's, not Daniel's, one near the window, the one I used to sit but never sit in. I didn't stay long, just enough to let the quiet settle in, enough to let it be real. Outside, a school group passed by the vineyard rows on a guided tour. One of the kids pointed at the digital irrigation panel mounted on the fence line, the one I helped design 3 years earlier during a consulting job before I ever imagined owning the property. They didn't know my name, not yet, but the new orchard would be planted next spring. The scholarship program would launch in the fall. The tennis courts were already being leveled for the community garden. Inside, I walked through the gallery, pausing at the room that would house the Eleanor Morgan Center for Agricultural Innovation. My mother's name etched in glass across the doorway. She never saw herself as powerful, but her hands built the foundation I stood on. Later that day, I joined Ethan for a budget review. The winery was operating at a modest profit. Visitor numbers were steady. We approved a salary bump for one of the seasonal managers and scheduled a review of vendor contracts. When the meeting ended, I sat alone in the boardroom for a while. No one called, no one interrupted. That evening I passed by Daniel's old office on the second floor. The door was still cracked open. His bookshelves had been cleared. The desk was bare. We still spoke occasionally messages about logistics, paperwork, occasional memories softened by time. There was no bitterness in them, just space. He had found an apartment near campus. I hadn't asked for details. I didn't need them. I paused in the hallway, remembering the version of me who had walked through this house 10 years earlier. Wearing a borrowed dress, clutching a salad bowl, smiling too wide. Hoping to be included. Hoping to matter. If I could speak to her now, I wouldn't tell her to speak up sooner or fight harder. I would tell her she was never meant to fit here. She was meant to build something better. The next morning, I arrived early to the main house. The staff had already opened the shutters and sunlight poured through the tall windows, casting soft gold across the floorboards. I walked through the hall alone. No chatter, no place cards, no plans for wine tastings or catered brunches, just the quiet hum of a place that had finally stopped pretending. I paused by the front entrance where framed photographs had once lined the walls, snapshots of harvest dinners, charity galas, family celebrations that I had helped prepare but never truly been part of. Most of the portraits had been taken down during renovations. A few remained, but their edges were faded and their moments felt distant. I didn't remove them. I simply added new ones, photos of the vineyard teams, the school kids on tour, a community volunteer group planting the first row of the new orchard. Later that afternoon, I joined a few employees for lunch in the courtyard. We sat beneath the same pergola where Margaret had once held seasonal teas. The tables were mismatched. The conversation was light. One of the field techs brought her granddaughter, who spent the meal asking questions about the vineyard, what grew where, when the grapes turned purple, whether bees really liked lavender. I answered every one. That night, as I walked the path behind the old tasting room, I stopped near the bench overlooking the western slope. The vines there were younger, still fragile, still learning the land. I stood quietly watching the wind move through the rows like a ripple across still water. I didn't think about the parties or the legacy talks or the years I spent trying to earn a seat. I thought about the soil, the people who cared for it, the hands that planted it before they were ever noticed. I had spent so long believing I had to be invited in, that if I just worked hard enough, stayed polite enough, I'd eventually be seen. But the truth was simpler than that. The table I needed didn't exist because I was meant to build it. And I did. Not with noise or revenge or spectacle, but with quiet consistency, with work that outlasted the wine glasses and folded napkins, with a door that stayed open even when others had closed it. Before I left the office that evening, I wrote one last note addressed to no one in particular. It said, "If you've ever been asked to prove your worth in a room that didn't see you, you're not alone. You never were." Then I folded the note and tucked it inside the new employee welcome folder. Thank you for listening. If this story reminded you of your own path of what you've had to build or walk away from, I'd love to hear it. Feel free to share your story in the comments or just know you're seen. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, you're always welcome here.